Hey everyone, we'll get started here in just a couple minutes. We're letting folks into the webinar room. Glad you're here. We'll get started here shortly. Well, I think we will just go ahead and jump in and get started. Happy Thursday afternoon, everyone. Hope it's been a great week. Looking forward to another awesome Launch Nebraska webinar session, and excited to dig into science today. I always enjoy when we have an opportunity to talk about science education. So thanks for being here. Just a couple of reminders, the webinars from Tuesday are posted on the Launch Nebraska website, including the slides, the tools, the templates. One thing I did just want to mention too is that as we think about this, basically what we're doing is, there's right now 8 hours of free virtual professional learning that's available. So feel free to check it out. If you missed a session, they're archived. Feel free to share with your staff as well. So we can click to the next slide and then do one more after that, I think. Yep, there we go. We'll go right on to this. So just a reminder, this professional learning series, this is number 9 of 10. So we have one more next week. Really what we're hoping to be able to, and I feel good about us providing clear and actionable information that districts will be able to utilize this summer as they are not only thinking about summer learning, which I know a lot of you are already deep into, but then really thinking about the next school year. And as always, our partner in this is SchoolKit, but today we have a special guest, which I'm excited to share with you in just a second. Our session today is about supporting independent science learning. And so I've asked our resident science guru, Dr. Sarah Cooper, to join us today. Some of you might know Sarah. She used to work for the Nebraska Department of Education, but just really thankful that she's going to lead us through today's session to really help us think about how we can leverage out-of-school science learning and what that means relative to systems thinking. So Sarah, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Great, thanks Corey. Hi everyone, great to have you with us today. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet, this is me. As Corey said, I like to call myself the science guru because that sounds so much nicer and so much more helpful than a science consultant. I had been at NDE as the science education specialist. Before that, I was at UNL with the environmental studies program. And before that, I taught high school physical science, biology, forensic science, and geoscience at Lincoln Southwest. Beginning in August, I'll be working for ESU 5 as the science and how coordinator. And a fun fact about me, I love it when people ask me about my sand collection. I have over 200 sand samples from around the world, and I really love to get them out and show everyone all of the really cool patterns and all of the really cool things about my sand collection. So thank you for joining us again from wherever you are. We're happy to have you here as we learn about science. A few session norms. So for those of you that are new to the program, this might be new norms for you. And for the rest of you, just hold on to your hats as we let everyone know what we're up to here. So do use the Q&A feature if you have questions or technology logistics issues. Go to the view options to exit full screen to access the links in your web browser. We're going to ask that you be a little bit active in this, so there'll be some links for you to go out and check out and do a little reading. We'll be asking you to type some responses in the chat as you reflect and share your thinking so that we can learn together. When we're asking you to chat, there will be a chat box that will show up, an icon here, so that you'll know when we're expecting you to give us some responses and share your thinking. For our time together today on our learning journey, we're going to spend a few minutes just setting some context and getting us established with our place and our setting and what we're going to be working toward today. We're going to look at systems thinking in science and what the relationship is between the two of those by deeply looking at some of the tools that systems thinkers and science thinkers use. And we're going to transition then to thinking about how do we take those tools, systems thinking and our science tools, into learning in different spaces and places to make sure that our students are having many opportunities to engage in science learning. And then we'll follow up with some next steps. Along the way, I'll also be taking you on a tour of some resources that might be helpful as you engage in your summer learning plans. So to really frame our conversation, I want to set this big picture out there and have us really thinking about what are the unintended consequences if students don't have the opportunity to learn science. So take a moment, jot down a couple of your ideas right now. What happens if kids don't have opportunities to learn science? So what? What do you think right now? And we're going to be revisiting this question. So I do want to start from a place of curiosity. I'm curious, why are you here today? Why did you come to join this session on science? And I'll give you a moment to pause, and I'd love to have some of you chat, share with me why you're here today and what you hope to learn. And while we might not be able to answer all of your questions and address all of the reasons you're here to learn, at least it will give us some guidelines for next steps. And while you are sending some chats, I just want to share with you a little anecdote. So one of my favorite parts about the job with NDE was getting to meet so many teachers across the state. And in my conversations with teachers over the years, there's been a really interesting dichotomy. So when I talk to primary teachers and elementary teachers, they get so excited about all of the questions their kids ask, and they talk about how curious they are. And they worry that they don't know what to do with all those student questions. Like, how do you handle so many student questions? And then when I talk to middle school and high school teachers, and I ask them what their vision for students is, what their vision for science is, we hear a really different story. We hear them wishing that students were curious, wishing that students were asking questions. So it does kind of make you stop and wonder, where did all that curiosity go? What happened to all of those questions? So I see some of you have typed some answers in the chat. And it looks like we've got lots of great ideas and school board members joining us. Wonderful. Best practices for teaching remotely. Summer science, I love it, yes. All right. So continue to share if you would like. And I want to share with you my why I'm here and why this session. I'm here because I love every opportunity to talk to people about science. I'm here because I had adults and peers, teachers, family, and friends who encouraged me in science, regardless of the place or space I was in. I'm here because as a child, and still as an adult, frankly, I am awed and inspired and curious about the world around me. I am here because when I look around our world and I see how much technology has pervaded our world, I wonder what life is going to be like in the future for our students, for our children, for our grandchildren. I grew up on a dairy farm, so the first time I saw a robot milking a cow, I was blown away. Drone cotton farmers, 3D printed houses, virtual reality, cybersecurity, Alexa in all of our homes. Like, this isn't science fiction. It's a new language and it's a new world. And it's a world that I could never imagine. And it really makes me wonder, like, what are jobs gonna look like in 50 years? What's the world gonna look like in 50 years? And I'm here because I recognize that in this rapidly changing and technological world, that sometimes we forget that the foods we eat, the air we breathe, the clothes we wear, the water we drink, and the oxygen, the air that makes our climate, that makes our planet habitable, it all comes from the earth. And that's why we need systems thinkers. So that's a little context. Let's move into what is systems thinking and its relationship to science. And don't forget, we're still thinking about that big question out there. What happens if students don't have opportunities to learn science? So to understand systems thinking, I'm going to share with you a short video. It's an example of what can happen when maybe systems thinking wasn't there. Maybe it went awry. As you watch the video, think about how you would define systems thinking. Why is it important? Who needs it? And then be ready to type some of your responses in the chat.
In the 1950s, the Dayak people of Borneo, an island in Southeast Asia, were suffering from an outbreak of malaria, so they called the World Health Organization for help. The World Health Organization had a ready-made solution, which was to spray copious amounts of DDT around the island. With the application of DDT, the mosquitoes that carried the malaria were knocked down, and so was the malaria. There were some interesting side effects, though. The first was that the roofs of people's houses began to collapse on their heads. Turns out the DDT not only killed off the malaria-carrying mosquitoes, but it also killed a species of parasitic wasps that had controlled a population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch being what the roofs of the Dayak people's homes were made from. Without the wasps, the caterpillars multiplied and flourished and began munching their way through the villagers' roofs. That was just the beginning. The DDT affected a lot of the island's other insects, which were eaten by the resident population of small lizards called geckos. The biological half-life of DDT is around 8 years, so animals like geckos do not metabolize it very fast. It stays in their system for a long time. Over time, the geckos began to accumulate pretty high levels of DDT, and while they tolerated the DDT fairly well, the island's resident cats, which dined on the geckos, did not. The cats ate the geckos, and the DDT contained in the geckos killed the cats. With the cats gone, the island's population of rats came out to play. We all know what happens when rats multiply and flourish. Pretty soon the Dayak people were back on the phone to the World Health Organization, only this time it wasn't malaria that was the problem. It was the plague and the destruction of their grain stores, both of which were caused by the overpopulation of rats. This time, though, the World Health Organization didn't have a ready-made solution and had to invent one. What did they do? They decided to parachute live cats into Borneo. Operation Cat Drop occurred courtesy of the Royal Air Force and eventually stabilized the situation.
All right, I'd love for you to take a moment and type in the chat what that video had to tell you about systems thinking, why it's important, who needs it, or any other thing that stood out to you as you watched the story of the Borneo cats. Solutions often contain unintended consequences and feedbacks. I have to admit that's something that really stood out to me too, those unintended consequences. Systems thinking is a big picture. Students need to learn this type of critical, forward-looking thinking to solve real-life problems. Everyone needs systems thinking. We need to be able to see how things interact to anticipate unintended consequences. I love that what you're sharing out is what stood out to me too, that idea of the unintended consequences, and that sometimes when we need to find an answer to a question or find a solution to a problem, it's not always the immediate response that is the best one. And we miss that if we don't have systems thinking. Sorry, technical difficulties there. All right, so let's talk about tools, because I want to make connections to science. Now, obviously that video gave us a great prelude to thinking about science and systems thinking, but I want to share for those of you that aren't familiar with our new tools in science, in our new standards, that what I love about science is that, first of all, everything is connected, and everything we know about science was a discovery. And sometimes we forget that when we reduce science to being a body of facts, and we forget that scientists actually have these tools that we use to discover. And the cross-cutting concepts is one of those sets of tools. In science, we call these tools the cross-cutting concepts. So I'm wondering if some of them might look familiar to some of you. If you've seen them somewhere other than science, feel free to share that in the chat. But in science, these are the tools that help us apply our thinking across all of the science domains. They help us effectively break down the silos that put science into disciplines. And that's why we can think of science as interconnected or integrated. So what do these tools mean? You're going to need to know a little bit about these tools because we are going to try to apply them here in a minute. This is what these tools mean. Observed patterns in nature guide organization and classification and prompt questions about relationships and causes underlying them. All events have causes, sometimes simple, sometimes multifaceted, and deciphering causal relationships and the mechanisms by which they are mediated is a major activity of science and engineering. In considering phenomena, it is critical to recognize what is relevant at different size, time, and energy scales, and to recognize proportional relationships between different quantities as scales change. A system is an organized group of related objects or components. Models can be used for understanding and predicting the behavior of systems. Tracking energy and matter flows into, out of, and within systems helps us to understand a system's behavior. The way an object is shaped or structured determines many of its properties and functions. For both designed and natural systems, conditions that affect stability and factors that control rates of change are critical elements to consider and understand. These are the cross-cutting concepts. Let's take a look at another set of tools that scientists and engineers have at our disposal. These are the science and engineering practices. As you look at this set of tools, can you imagine ways that they could be used outside of science? Feel free to chat your thinking, even though I couldn't squeeze a chat icon box on here. But how do you see these being used outside of science? Where and when? I want to point out that these tools are intentionally called practices, and they're not just skills. They're practices because practices require skill and practice-specific knowledge. Students need to know when and how and where to use practices. They're to be used in the service of sense-making, for explaining phenomena and finding solutions to problems, not just rote learning a skill. I see lots of connections here to social sciences, to politics, problem solving. The world is using this right now to solve the COVID pandemic. Yes, the practices are everywhere. I love it. And what I love, I always say about the practices when I look at them, and I love when elementary teachers really look at them and they're like, yeah, we do these things and use these practices in math, and we use these practices in English language arts too. And that just reaffirms my belief that the only reason we need to learn to read and the only reason we need to learn math is so that we can do our science, because that's the really fun part. All right, so now that we know the tools that scientists have at our disposal to use to explore the world, let's see how that relates to systems thinking. So I found this really great article that I love, because even though systems thinking was born in the business world, we use it everywhere, as many of you pointed out and made that connection. Let's look at these tools and the connections, the language that are used to describe the tools of systems thinkers here. I think you're going to find some connections to cross-cutting concepts in science and engineering practices. I'm not sure though. We'll see. That's up to you to figure out. But I'm willing to make the claim that the tools used in systems thinking overlap with the tools used by scientists and engineers. Your job is to read the article. You'll have 5 minutes and see if you can find evidence that either supports or refutes my claim. I'm going to start a 5-minute timer. Our helpful friend Kaylee is going to type the link to this article in the chat, and you'll have 5 minutes of quiet reading time to see what you can learn about the tools that systems thinkers use and how they relate to science. And I want to make sure you've got the link in the chat. And I'm going to start your timer. You'll know to come back when the crickets are chirping. All right, that's your signal to wrap up your reading. And come back and share with us some evidence that you found to either support or refute the claim that the tools used in systems thinking overlap with the tools used by scientists and engineers. What evidence did you find in the reading? Please feel free to send us some of your thinking in the chat. I see Anna pulled out a quote there. A systems thinker uses this mindset to entangle the work within the complexity of life on Earth. That quote stood out to me as well. Yes. Other connections between systems thinking and science tools. Yes, the relationship, we saw cause and effect in there. Obviously, the systems and system models as a cross-cutting concept, and developing and using models as a practice. Those really support and encourage science and systems thinking together. Cause and effect, stability and change, system models, and that interdependence. Yeah. Something that really stood out for me, and I think it's because I really like our science shifts. I liked the idea that this is a shift too in thinking. To develop a systems thinking mindset requires some shifts, just like our shift in science requires this huge shift from thinking about science as something we learn about to thinking about science as something that we figure out. All right, so we've made some connections here. We can see that there's some overlap. I want to take us back out to our big question that you're thinking about. So we can see that there's a relationship between systems thinking and the tools that scientists and engineers use to explore their world. So what? So what if students don't have opportunities to learn science? What might that mean for their opportunities to develop systems thinking? And vice versa, frankly. Continue to keep thinking about this question and we'll wrap it up at the end. All right, so that was a really short dive into this idea of systems thinking in science. I do have some resources for those of you that want to go deeper into systems thinking that we'll share at the end. But now let's think about how can we take those tools and use them in different learning spaces and places so that we're helping students develop both systems thinking and science thinking. So we first have to ask ourselves this question: where does science learning even take place? And when we stop and look at the numbers, where students are actually spending their time, I think we need to get really creative as we think about where we can have opportunities for students to learn science. That it needs to happen in a variety of places and spaces, and that we need to think of these different spaces and places as ways that they can generate learning and really take advantage of what different spaces outside of school have to offer. And I love to borrow some of the language from early elementary when they talk about the environment as a third teacher. Like, how do we start to think about the spaces outside of school as another teacher, the environment as the third teacher for our students? So no matter what, no matter where the space or the place that learning is taking place, there are shared goals for learning. These are the shared goals that really support the vision of science that we're working toward, that students are working to make sense of real-world phenomenon problems. We want students to be able to wade through the noise of information and be scientifically literate. We want them to see that science is everywhere in their world. It's all around them. And we really want them to feel empowered and confident, self-directed and self-aware, so that they're able to connect learning everywhere they go in the world as they navigate on their journey, whether that's for post-secondary world, civic readiness, whatever career path they go down. We want them to feel prepared to understand the science that affects their lives every day. Those are shared goals for student learning, regardless of the place. And as we think about the learning experiences that students are engaged in those spaces and places, there are some essential features there as well. You see the overlap of the relevant and meaningful phenomena, and those need to be developmentally appropriate. We want to challenge students to push their thinking and make sure that what we provide them is developmentally appropriate. Students really need opportunities to engage with peers and adults in social sense making, whatever that looks like. Many ways to engage in social sense making as we think about even in this virtual world, but that opportunity to hear other perspectives and engage in conversation and dialogue with others is critical. This idea of self-reflection, that's an essential feature of what we want students doing when they're engaged in science, to really think about their thinking. And we know that when we use productive uncertainty to drive student thinking, like that's how we get to deeper thinking. That's how we get kids to recognize that there are still things in the world that are there for them to explore. And we know no matter what the place and space, students need access to sufficient materials, resources, expertise, so that they can engage in meaningful and coherent learning experiences. And that's a shift I think we do want to call out, that idea of coherent learning experiences. And that means that it makes sense to the students why they're learning, what they're learning. And we think about different places and spaces that make that coherence so much easier for students to understand. And above all, we want to make sure that all learning experiences for students are providing supportive physical and social emotional environments. Shifts again, right? As we think about achieving these goals and creating these experiences for students that are going to engage them in the science learning that we want, we need to really think about how our roles are shifting as well. And the role of students, the role of teachers, the role of families and communities and leaders, everyone in this community, learning community, their roles needs to shift so that we can engage students in those types of learning experiences that are going to deepen their science thinking, help them use their science tools and develop their systems thinking. So I'm going to share the resource with you that this came out of. I challenge you to dive into that resource and think about you and your role and what your current role might look like and what it might need to look like as we shift our science learning. And I think this is one of my favorite graphics of the roles that everyone can play in student learning experiences that support student science learning. Like there is a role for everyone. And this graphic really speaks to that regardless of whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a caregiver, a sibling, an uncle, an aunt, there is a role for you in supporting student science learning. And so I encourage you to share this list of roles broadly with our students so that they're surrounded, like I was, with adults in their life that are going to support them in their science endeavors. All of those graphics come out of this resource, and we're going to do a little walkthrough together because this is a really important resource that I want you to be able to explore on your own later. So there's a brief introduction here of the various resources that are contained here. So there's some immediate support, some long-term supports, self-care resources, and more information about the resources. The graphics we were just looking at came out of this long-term supports document, but I want to take a look at some of these immediate supports because you're going to find, if you haven't found these resources already, that they're very useful. One, because they're written in versions that are appropriate for families and for students, as well as they're translated into many different languages. So they have a broad application for many of our communities. Then there's these additional long-term supports. And all of these have some great strategies that you might think about implementing in your space and place to support science learning. And I want to draw attention to one of these in particular, because phenomena, if you haven't heard phenomena, it always makes you think of the Muppets Phenomena. Phenomena is what science is all about, right? Giving kids something to wonder and figure out. So there's some great resources in here to help you think about, how do we expose kids to phenomena, and what can I do with students at different age levels with phenomena? And in all of these resources, there's some great citizen science projects. One of my favorites is Phenomena for NGSS, and they've created some new virtual science education resources as well. And they're really designed to help kids engage with science in the space and place that they're in right now, using everyday phenomena. So these are resources that you can dive into a little more deeply as you think about how you're going to support science students in your space and place, in your roles. All right. The other resource I want to share with you, I know that early in elementary, sometimes in science, is a real struggle, and we wonder how to engage our primary students in meaningful and effective science. And I love that this site has really worked hard to develop some materials that engage young students, kindergarten through grade 3, in learning in their place, and really focused on building this understanding of systems in a place-based way that's appropriate for kindergarten through third graders and their families. So in particular, their For the Families in their seasonal storyline has many activities that support families and their young learners in engaging in science in really meaningful ways. And one of the things that is really neat about the resources they use is how they incorporate this asking should we questions, which adds this social perspective to the science that we know is always prevalent. So there is a great series of resources here, and you can see how they really try to attend to space and place and even the seasons, right? Think about what we can learn by observing outdoors, just as the seasons change. And so the resources they've designed for families really try to capture that. And for educators, they currently have built out 2 frameworks that can be applicable to a broader range of curriculum and instruction and assessment and resources. So the first framework is on culture, learning, and identity, and the second one is on socio-ecological histories of places. And as you dive into this framework, it just screams at you this idea of the cross-cutting concepts of systems and scales and stability and change, and what really happens when we think about the socio-ecological histories of places. And you see the deep connections to the social sciences and the history and culture in that framework. So definitely some great resources for you to explore in this as well. There is a series of resources that I have curated and collected for you that will take you on a journey to explore several different resources. Whoa, sorry, possessed here. And you can start to think about, what are some of the resources that are going to help you support the students that you need to support in your communities, in your role, in your space and place. And you're going to find in there that there's some resources that students can go and explore on their own. You're going to find that there's resources that sometimes need an adult to support them. Some are totally technology free, and others do require some technology. So I'm going to pop out to that resource here. I tried to identify, so the COVID, the first one we looked at, there are tons and tons of resources in here. So know that that's the resource we walked through. We just looked at learning in places, and we also looked at NGSS Phenomena, virtual science learning. so many other things to explore. And what I tried to do was find some resources that you weren't going to find maybe on some of these other lists. And in particular, I want to point out the idea of global connections, and this idea that science is a global endeavor, and there's ways that we can connect students in out of school spaces and in school spaces with students across the globe, because they have those capabilities and that access now. So again, more resources for you to explore there. And see if I can get back. So this is where we are. We set some context by thinking about why we're here. We engaged in a little dip in the pool of systems thinking, and you've learned some about the science tools that scientists and engineers have to explore our world and the relationship that those tools have to systems thinking. And we've thought a little bit about how we can take those tools and use them in different spaces and places. And probably what I've left you with is lots and lots of resources that you get to go and explore on your own. But now I do want to come back to this question, and I do want us to stop and think about it and pause and reflect. What are you thinking now about the unintended consequences if students don't have opportunities to learn science? As you think about the tools that scientists and engineers use, as you think about system science, as you think about the world in which we live and how it's changing, what happens if students don't have opportunities to learn science? And type some of your thinking in the chat if you. So I'm going to read a few comments from the chat here. Ellen says, we have people who will rely on potentially harmful information because they do not have the scientific literacy and critical thinking skills to make informed decisions about the information that is available. Students don't have the knowledge and skills to be effective global citizens, and we destroy our world. Science is all around us. Without the opportunity to learn science, they are missing out on life experiences in their everyday lives. Stephanie's pointed out they will become, I lost it, that there won't be as much curiosity. They'll have difficulty being problem solvers in their future jobs. They'll have difficulty critically thinking. And I do think about that, like the jobs that we know today, they certainly didn't exist even 10 years ago. And so just in such short amounts of times, the jobs are changing so rapidly. And science is connected in so many ways to the jobs now and in the future. Science is the accumulation of all other skills and the application of those skills to understand the world we live in. Without the opportunity to learn science in an effective way, we may stunt or shut down the systems we rely on. These are some really great reflections. I thank you for sharing that with me. And I think now poses a really interesting challenge for all of us, right? If students aren't in classrooms, how do we help families, communities, support them in the spaces and places they're in? And we have to do it without thinking that they're going to have lab equipment and supplies. So how do we take advantage of the spaces they're in? How do we take advantage of students' interests in science? How do we keep them curious? How do we keep the questions coming? That's our challenge to figure out. And hopefully you're going to find some solutions in the resources that you get to go and explore when we're done here. But more importantly, we probably need some new solutions to these problems. And if we think that our school is not going to be disrupted again, I think we'll be surprised, right? I mean, in Nebraska, we have floods, we have blizzards. Our school is interrupted all of the time. How can we work with our students to make sure that these transitions in these disruptive times are less disruptive, that they can go out into the world regardless of where they are and what's going on, and they'll continue to have this mindset of trying to figure out what's going on in the world, of using those cross-cutting concepts to solve problems and see things across boundaries of disciplines and domains. How do we help them to keep asking the questions, not only in science, but in all of their spaces that are going to drive toward change and deeper learning for everyone? We have to figure out, we have to find some new solutions to these problems. And I have no doubts that the group of people here, that we can figure some of this out together. So I want to leave you coming full circle before I turn it back to Corey. And I want us to circle back to this idea of curiosity. So this is just a really short video clip out of what was one of my favorite books. And I hate to think how long ago it was, but it was Brain Rules. And this is John Medina, and he's talking about a chapter in his book of exploration. And maybe we can take something from this that can help us all stop and pause and think about how we engage in science and how we can support young learners in engaging in science.
My 2-year-old son Noah and I were walking down the street on our way to preschool when he suddenly noticed a shiny pebble embedded in the concrete. Stopping mid-stride, the little guy considered it for a second, found it thoroughly delightful, and let out a laugh. He spied a small plant an inch farther, a weed valiantly struggling through a crack in the asphalt. He touched it gently, then laughed again. Noah noticed beyond it a platoon of ants marching in single file, which he bent down to examine closely. They were carrying a dead bug, and Noah clapped his hands in wonder. There were dust particles, a rusted screw, a shiny spot of oil. 15 minutes had passed, and we had only gone 20 feet. I tried to get him to move along. After all, I had to get him to school so he could learn. Suddenly I stopped, watching my little teacher, wondering how long it had been since I had taken 15 minutes to walk 20 feet. The greatest brain rule of all is something I cannot prove or characterize, but I believe in with all my heart. As my son was trying to tell me, it is the importance of curiosity. For his sake, and for ours, I wish classrooms and businesses were designed with the brain in mind. Though we currently have...
All right. So that took us full circle. I'd love for you to stop and pause and think about how you're going to support your learners. Please reach out to Corey. Please reach out to me if you need additional resources. Please work collaboratively together, work smarter, not harder, as we support our teachers, our families, our educators in trying to find ways to creatively support science learning so our students have those opportunities and they're not missing out. And a scale, proportion, and quantity challenge, like our kids, there's one planet. We're approaching 9 billion people. Our kids have to figure out how to make that work. They're going to need some science to do that. So thank you for joining me, and I'm going to turn it back over to Corey.
Great, thanks, Sarah. One thing that I just kept thinking about too, of the unintended consequences if students don't have the opportunity to learn science, is what does that mean for student engagement? Because we know that science is a great way to keep our learners engaged, not only in the world around them, but in school. And so I think that that is definitely something that as you're planning and thinking about the fall, understanding and recognizing how science can help keep kids engaged, especially in a remote space. I know that many of you are sharing numbers, and I've been on calls where folks are sharing numbers around what engagement looked like in the spring. And so if we have to be in a prolonged remote learning environment, I think it's important to consider how we might be able to increase those engagement numbers utilizing science. I recognize that that's easier said than done, but I think that's an important consideration. The other thing that I wanted to talk just a little bit about too is just from an equity perspective. Sarah and I both can share examples where not all students have access to science education. I field calls from folks who think about starting science in 4th grade. And I just wonder what that does if we aren't providing grade level instruction for all learners. We have standards that start at the kindergarten level. They're intentionally and purposefully built. So especially in a remote environment, we know that many students of color, our students with disability, and our English learners, if they're struggling to get science when we're face to face, what does that mean if we're in a remote environment? And I really worry that we're going to lose some of our equity perspective around science because of that. We know that math and literacy are important, but we also know that science is a great tool to engage students in mathematical discourse and in the instructional shifts for literacy as well, and how we help students build knowledge to support early reading as well. So if you have questions around what that might look like, please let us know. I did want to highlight a couple of resources, and the link is there on the webpage as well. We've done a lot of great work led by Sarah over the last several years to really elevate science education in the state. Number one, starting with a clear vision for what you want science education to look like in your district. And if you're listening to this and you're like, I'm not really sure what science education should look like or what we should do, start with that vision for instruction. What does high quality science instruction actually look like? The other resources that are on there are some resources that Sarah already previewed, the supporting science learning during COVID. Also, there's some great asynchronous professional learning opportunities. If you're new to the science standards and you're like, someone used the phrase 3-dimensional and I'm not sure what that means, Sarah's actually built a module that actually unwraps the standards. We don't want to unpack the science standards. I'm going to say that again. We don't want to unpack the science standards because of how they're purposefully built. So take a look at that module that helps you think about, like, what are the three dimensions of the science standards. The other thing that I think might be helpful in this space is there are parent guides that also provide some support back to understanding the standards. So as we continue to see the need for communicating to parents in this space, communicating the why behind science instruction for all grade levels is so important. Those are available in English and Spanish. Feel free to download, edit, however you'd like to use those. And if you need some more additional help with those, let us know. So yeah, that's my science soapbox, which Sarah always inspires me to stand on as well. So certainly an advocate and passionate about science education in Nebraska. a couple of things I'm going to preview before we sign off for today. Next Tuesday is another webinar for our last webinar, which is really what we're calling Planning to Pivot. So we're going to highlight some broad resources that you might be thinking about as you're making plans for re-entry. It's one before that, Sarah. It's okay too. Yeah, there we go. It's Tuesday the 16th at 4:30. The other thing that I mentioned on Tuesday's webinar is the Department of Education continues to work on building re-entry supports around teaching and learning and professional learning. And stay tuned, those things they take a while to develop. We're trying to be intentional about how they're linked with staffing and scheduling and operations, as well as the health considerations as well. We do have a link to a survey if you would take just a couple of minutes to provide us some feedback. I see it's in the chat box. I know some folks have issues with the tiny URL, so I'm also putting the link to a Google form in there also. So hope you'll give us some feedback on today's session. And I want to say thanks to Sarah for leading us in this journey and facilitating a great conversation today, and appreciate all of you taking a little bit of time out of your busy summer schedules to join us and talk about something super important, which is science education for Nebraska kids. So with that, we'll sign off 3 minutes early, and hope you have a good rest of the week, and then we look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.